The California coast met them in the soft, golden light of the setting sun as Sarah and James Harper stopped the car at an old, almost abandoned sign, Secluded Beach House. The narrow path, hidden by thick stands of laurel and pine trees, stretched toward the sea, away from noisy roads and prying eyes. James stepped out first, squared his shoulders, and inhaled the salty ocean air deeply. As if trying to take in all that expanse and freshness, Sarah stayed in the car, her gaze fixed on the screen of her phone, which flashed a new message. A short sigh, a slight shadow of worry on her face, but in a second she was outside with a dazzling smile, as if nothing had happened. The cabin stood on the edge of a cliff, with a breathtaking view of the vast ocean. A faint breeze fluttered the white curtains on the windows, and the waves battered the rocks below, creating a measured, almost soothing noise. James picked up their suitcases and headed confidently for the front door, followed by Sarah, looking around slowly as if assessing the new place. Inside, they found a simple but cozy setting: light wood floors, ivory walls, and large windows that let in the warm evening light. Everything here seemed designed for a week of solitude and peace. The first few days did indeed go as they had planned. Mornings began with a swim in the cold waters of the ocean. Afternoons were spent walking along deserted beaches where the only witnesses to their happiness were seagulls, and evenings were spent on the terrace watching the sunset change to a starry night. Sarah sat on a chaise lounge with a glass of white wine in her hand, while James leaned over a book and occasionally looked up to look at her. His eyes expressed serene satisfaction, but something in her demeanor remained wary. Sarah was often distracted by her phone, answering messages with short, almost machine-like movements of her fingers, as if trying not to draw attention to it. One such evening, they went for a swim in the sea by moonlight. The water was icy, but that didn't stop them. Sarah stood waist-deep in the water, her hair stuck to her neck, and her eyes glittering in the darkness. James swam around her, laughing and throwing playful splashes at her. However, even as he reached for her, trying to pull her closer, she seemed to pull back, holding the invisible boundary between them. A cold glint flickered in her gaze, which disappeared as quickly as it appeared when he noticed it. On the third day of their stay, something changed. Sarah had abandoned her plans to go on an excursion to the nearest town, citing a sudden onset of weakness and dizziness. James didn't insist, though it was obvious from his tense face that he was disappointed. He drove off alone, promising to be back for dinner, and left her alone in the house. As soon as the sound of the motor faded into the distance, Sarah instantly shifted into a different state of mind. She glanced around nervously, closed the curtains and picked up her phone. A few quick taps on the screen, long beeps on the receiver before someone answered. The conversation was tense, her voice quiet, almost a whisper, but through the tension, a note of impatience slipped into her intonation. She spoke quickly, choosing her words clearly, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. But as soon as she heard the rumble of an approaching car in the driveway, she cut the conversation short and hid the phone. James had returned sooner than she'd expected, and his appearance had taken her by surprise. "Is everything okay?" he asked, scrutinizing her face, which had not yet settled into a mask of calm. "Yeah, just a little tired," she answered too quickly, looking away as if looking for another excuse to avoid the conversation. James held his gaze on her face a little longer than usual, but he remained silent, nodding as if he accepted her explanation. That night, James woke up suddenly. There was a deep silence in the house, broken only by the sound of the wind swaying the pine trees outside the windows. He reached out towards Sarah, but her place was empty and cold. He sat up on the bed, listening. From behind the ajar door came a barely perceptible noise, like the rustle of footsteps on the terrace. Barefoot, he walked across the wooden floor, his footsteps almost silent. Stepping out onto the terrace, he found Sarah standing at the very edge, barely illuminated by the light of the moon. She was wrapped in a thin robe, and her hair was fluttering in the wind. Sarah looked out at the dark ocean, as if searching its depths for something inaccessible. "What are you doing here?" he asked, coming closer. She flinched, as if she had been taken by surprise, and turned to him. Her face seemed tense, her eyes full of anxiety. "I couldn't sleep. The wind," she said in a flat, almost colorless voice, trying to put a smile on her face. James looked down at the shoreline, but saw only the swaying trees and the white crests of the waves that seemed to reach out from the night. He stepped closer and put his arm around her shoulders, his embrace soft but insistent. "Let's go inside. It's cold in here," he said quietly, leaning in close to her ear. Sarah nodded and obediently allowed herself to be led into the house, but even lying in bed beside him, she couldn't sleep a wink, listening to every creak of the floorboards and howl of the wind outside the window. The next morning, their communication became even more strained. Sarah was silently preparing breakfast, and James didn't try to break the strange silence either. He tried to take her hand again, but it slipped from his fingers like a fish slipping into water. "We could have dinner on the beach tonight," he suggested, trying to rouse some enthusiasm. "Yes, of course, that would be wonderful," she replied, but her voice sounded as if she didn't care at all. At night, they sat on the terrace again, watching the endless splashing of the waves under the silver light of the moon. James was pouring wine into glasses when Sarah suddenly stood up and walked toward the house. "I'll only be a minute," she said, and disappeared out the door. 10 minutes passed, then 15. James waited a little longer and then went into the house, but she was nowhere to be found. There was silence in the empty rooms, broken only by the sound of the distant surf. The morning after a restless night, the sea was calm, but the house was tensely quiet. Sarah drank her coffee in silence, staring at the gray skyline, while James shifted his eyebrows and looked at the brochures for excursions. He tried to draw her into the discussion, suggesting a trip to the nearest town, but she only shrugged uncertainly. "Sounds interesting, but I'm not feeling very well," she said finally, setting her cup aside. "I should probably stay in tonight." James lingered on her, studying her face, but didn't insist. He noticed her fingers tapping nervously on the table, but decided not to press her. Lately, any attempt to get Sarah to talk had hit an invisible wall. "Okay, I'll go myself," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Maybe I'll pick up something for dinner." She nodded, and her gaze slid back to the phone on the table. The screen blinked, announcing a new message, but Sarah quickly flipped its screen down, as if trying to hide something obvious from him. When the sound of his car faded into the distance, Sarah changed instantly. She jumped up from her seat, grabbed her phone, and as if out of habit, locked herself in the bathroom. Her voice was muffled by the closed door, but every now and then there were scraps of phrases spoken in a strained whisper. Her tone was harsh and emphatic, but the words were lost behind the sound of the water running from the faucet. "It's too dangerous. No, I can't go on like this. You promised it would be different," she said through the noise. Then a short pause, as if someone on the other end of the line had been talking longer than usual, and she listened with the receiver pressed to her ear. "Yes, I know, but he's here, and that complicates things. Okay, I'll call you back later." Sarah abruptly ended the call, glanced at her reflection in the mirror, and paused for a moment. Her face was pale and there was a worried glint in her eyes, but she quickly cleaned herself up and left the bathroom. It was all automatic, like a long, practiced ritual. She made her way back to the living room, but no sooner had she taken a step than the sound of the engine again. James was back sooner than she'd expected, and her face froze for a moment, as if caught in the headlights. But when he entered the house with a bag of groceries, she had already greeted him with a duty smile, as if nothing had happened. "I thought you'd be resting," he remarked, looking at her tired appearance. "Yeah, I tried." She smiled faintly, but her voice sounded strained. "Thanks for bringing all this stuff." James nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his gaze. Something about her behavior lately had been becoming more and more unclear and disturbing, but he couldn't grasp a specific detail. Everything slipped away like water through his fingers. In the evening, when the sun was already hidden behind the horizon line, they cooked dinner together. James was chopping vegetables, Sarah was setting out the dishes. The atmosphere between them seemed surprisingly calm, but something unspoken lurked beneath the surface. Suddenly, the silence was broken by another beep from her phone, lying on the kitchen counter. "Your messages again?" James glanced at the screen, but Sarah quickly grabbed the device without giving him even a glimpse of the sender. "Just notifications, nothing important," she cut him off. His patience was wearing thin. He threw the knife on the table and the metallic sound reverberated off the walls, seeming to shatter the tense silence. "I'm tired of this, Sarah." His voice became low and harsh. "You're not giving me the slightest chance to understand what's going on. I mean, we came here to be together, and you're not here all the time." She tossed the phone on the table and turned away, resting her hands on the edge of the sink. "You just have to trust me, James," she said quietly, as if she weren't talking to him, but to herself. "But how can I trust you if you hide from me every time he calls?" He stepped closer, and his shadow covered her figure. "You don't understand." Sarah turned to him with a grim look. "I'm trying to protect you, but you can't see it yourself." "Protect me from what?" James shook his head, his eyes glittering in the light of the dim lamp. "I'm here. Tell me the truth, whatever it is." But she remained silent, her lips tightly pressed together, as if she were afraid that any word she said would open a chasm from which there would be no escape. Late in the afternoon, they tried to smooth things over. Sitting on the terrace with glasses of wine, they spoke little, and each of them avoided looking into the other's eyes for more than a few seconds. James was the first to break the silence. "I want to believe you, Sarah, but I feel like I'm living with a ghost. You disappear every time I try to get close." She leaned forward, setting her glass on the table, and covered her face with her hands. "I understand how it looks," she said finally, her voice muffled. "But there are some things it's better not to know. Believe me, I don't want to hurt you." His patience was cracking at the seams again, but he held back, taking a deep breath. His inner voice told him that there was more behind her words than he'd realized. "Maybe," he replied quietly, trying to sound calmer than he actually felt. "But it's hard for me to keep pretending it's just your weirdness." She didn't answer, but her gaze drifted away again, somewhere deep into the night, toward the dark, shimmering stretch of ocean. It had been a few days since that evening, when the tension between Sarah and James had peaked, but then it seemed to subside, leaving behind a wary silence. Sarah spent more time on the terrace, looking out at the choppy sea, while James went for long walks along the deserted beaches. It seemed as if they had tacitly agreed not to discuss their differences anymore, but the invisible wall between them only grew higher. At the dawn of another day, Sarah awoke. It was not the familiar feeling of warmth beside her, but the cold of an empty bed. She pulled on a robe and walked down the stairs. The house was quiet, too quiet, even for this secluded place. James was nowhere to be seen, not in the kitchen, not on the terrace where he sometimes greeted the dawn with a cup of coffee. At first, she thought he'd gone for his morning run again, though his sneakers were still by the door. Sarah checked the living room, walked around the house and went outside, but all that greeted her was the sound of waves and the cries of seagulls. Then she headed for the driveway, but the car they'd left under the shade of the pine trees was gone too. Something clicked in her head, as if a pressurized internal spring had finally worked. At first, Sarah tried to keep her cool. She picked up her cell phone and called James. Long beeps filled the silence, but there was no answer. Another try, then another, all in vain. Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. She paced around the house, looking in every corner, as if she hoped he was hiding somewhere nearby, that it was just a ridiculous joke. But the longer her search lasted, the more futile it seemed. After several hours, as the sun rose high above the horizon and the light blue sky was laced with heat, Sarah finally gave up and dialed the police number. The operator's voice was calm and professional, but her explanation about her husband disappearing on their honeymoon sounded a little too mundane. A police car appeared on the road toward noon. The two officers, frowning and incredulous, listened to her rambling story, then began to look around the neighborhood. At first, it seemed routine, the usual disappearance of a grown man who might just want to be alone. But as they began searching the immediate area, one of them came across tire tracks leading from the side of the road. "Mrs. Harper, are you saying he left in your car?" Detective Jonathan Reed interjected as they approached the abandoned vehicle. "Yes, we rented it," she replied, trying to remain calm, but her eyes returned to the car again and again. The trunk was ajar, as if it had been closed in a hurry. Reed and his partner, Detective Marilyn Cross, glanced around before cautiously peering inside. At first, there seemed to be nothing much inside. A couple of empty water bottles, a road map left on the back seat. But then Cross pointed to a stain on the mat by the driver's seat. It was dark, almost black, and glistened unnaturally in the sun. "Looks like blood," she said quietly, leaning closer. "We'll have to analyze it." The side window was shattered. Shards were scattered around, and among them was another dark streak that could have been blood. Sarah stood a few feet away with her palm to her mouth, her face pale, but her expression was more stunned than frightened. "When was the last time you saw your husband?" Reed asked again, not taking his eyes off her. "At night before I went to bed," she answered faintly. "I woke up and he was gone." Cross was taking pictures on her phone. She stopped, looked at Sarah and asked, "Are you sure he didn't mention that he was going somewhere? Maybe he left a note?" Sarah shook her head. Tears glistened in her eyes, but something in her demeanor made the detective suspicious. They exchanged a brief glance, realizing that the case would not be as simple as it might seem at first glance. When the car was towed to a nearby parking lot for a closer inspection, the detectives returned to the house with Sarah. She was sitting on the couch, like a small figure in this big house that was suddenly too empty and foreign for her. Reed watched her, trying to figure out exactly what was bothering him about her behavior. Cross, meanwhile, was looking around the rooms, hoping to find any trace that might shed some light on the circumstances of James's disappearance. "Mrs. Harper, you said you'd had a little disagreement with your husband in recent days." Reed tried to speak softly, but his tone remained insistent. "Could he have left because of the argument?" We've had a few arguments like everyone else." Sarah clasped her hands together, her fingers white with tension. "But nothing serious. It was—" She was silent, as if trying to find the words. "It was stupid. We worked it out." Reed nodded, but there was a look of caution in his eyes. He knew that cases like this were rarely as simple as those who stayed behind described them. "We'll send samples for analysis and check your husband's recent phone calls," he said, rising. "Perhaps that will give us some leads." Sarah only nodded, lowering her head. Her fingers trembled again as she tried to fumble in her pocket for her cell phone. Detectives Jonathan Reed and Marilyn Cross returned to the scene the next day as the sun was just beginning to rise above the horizon, coloring the sky in soft pastel hues. It was clear to them that there was far more to the case of James Harper's disappearance than a simple family conflict or accident. There were more and more questions, and the answers remained shrouded in a fog of obscurity. They began with a detailed inspection of the house. Outside, it was a secluded spot on the edge of a cliff, isolated from the world, seemingly the perfect place for a honeymoon. Inside, sterile cleanliness, without a hint of hurry or struggle. But Reed and Cross knew that secrets often lurked in the most seemingly ordinary things. In a detailed search of the bedroom, Cross noticed something odd behind one of the paintings hanging on the wall. A small, almost imperceptible lens was hiding among the folds of the drapery. She carefully removed the painting and discovered a miniature camera hidden behind a wooden frame. "Looks like this isn't just a random disappearance," Cross said, turning to Reed. Someone was following them. Reed frowned and, without a word, started checking the rest of the rooms. Eventually, they found several more cameras, neatly placed in different corners of the house. The footage from the cameras was saved on a hard drive hidden behind a false panel in a closet. Back at the station, detectives submitted the footage to forensics. They soon gained access to footage of Sarah meeting with a male stranger. The man came to the house when James was away, and the video showed them talking animatedly about something on the terrace. Sarah looked nervous, but determined at the same time. There was an undercurrent of tension in her movements. "I think we have another suspect," Reed said, nodding at the monitor screen. "But who is he?" While the experts were analyzing the videos, the results of the blood test from the car came back. As expected, the samples matched James Harper's DNA. Moreover, the interior of the car, especially the passenger seat and the steering wheel, showed signs of struggle. Under the fingernails on the mat, there were traces of skin, indicating that James had clearly struggled before he disappeared. "Everything seems to point to a staged event," Cross summarized. "But who organized it? And why?" Reed nodded silently, absorbed in his own thoughts. The puzzle was beginning to come together. but many of the pieces were still only partially in place. Questions about how and why James had disappeared were becoming more and more confusing. While examining the Harper family's financial records, detectives discovered another disturbing detail. A week before the wedding, James had taken out a life insurance policy for an impressive sum, with his newlywed wife listed as the beneficiary. The amount of insurance was so large that any reasonable person would ask, "Why do you need such insurance at the very beginning of life together?" "It doesn't look like a coincidence," Reed muttered, looking at the paperwork. "The insurance, the secret meetings, the disappearance, it looks like a carefully planned move." "Do you think Sarah is in cahoots with this man?" Cross asked, coming up with a theory of her own. "Perhaps they were planning to get rid of James and split the money." "We don't have any direct evidence yet, but something tells me she's playing a more complicated game." Reed frowned, tapping his fingers on the table thoughtfully. Before the detectives could take further action, however, something unexpected happened. When Cross arrived at the Harper house in the morning to talk to Sarah again, she found the house empty. Sarah's belongings were gone, and so was she. No sign of forced entry, no hint of a hasty departure. It looked as if she'd just gone for a walk and never returned. "Her phone's been disconnected and she's withdrawn all the money from her accounts," Reed said, who was checking her bank transactions. "She was obviously planning something in advance." "Disappearing again." Cross pressed her lips together as she stared at the empty bedroom where, just yesterday, Sarah had sat like a cornered fox. "Now we need to find her before she escapes for good." They realized the situation had become more complicated. Sarah's disappearance and emptied accounts could mean both her involvement in the case and an attempt to hide from someone more dangerous than the detectives themselves. Detectives Jonathan Reed and Marilyn Cross, sitting in their office, concentrated on studying the map and the marked points of Sarah Harper's last transactions. She had disappeared without a trace, but her hasty actions had left a trail that wasn't hard to follow. Bank transactions and cell phone signals led them to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of a small coastal town. "She was obviously nervous to leave so many traces," Cross noted, handing Reed a fresh report on the analysis of her calls. "But why would she go there? Who's helping her?" "We'll find out soon enough," Reed replied, slamming the folder shut. "We're leaving now." The creaky warehouse gates were ajar, and it was pitch black inside, with only narrow rays of sunlight filtering in through the broken windows. The detectives cautiously moved closer, taking cover behind metal containers. Muffled voices came from there. Reed gestured for Cross to stay where she was, and he cautiously peered inside. Sarah was standing across from a man who looked exhausted and agitated. It was the same man they had seen on the videotapes from the Harper house. A look of despair and anger froze on Sarah's face. "You promised we'd do this quickly and quietly," Sarah hissed, her hands trembling and nervously tugging at the folds of her coat. "And now it's all falling apart. Because of you." The man, who detectives later identified as Mark Harris, her brother, frowned, clearly trying to calm her down. "I did everything you asked," he replied, trying to speak calmly. "But you decided to get rid of him, and that wasn't part of our original plan." The detectives realized they couldn't wait any longer. Reed came out of hiding and loudly commanded, "Police, hands in the air!" Mark froze, his eyes widening in horror, but Sarah, like a cornered animal, tried to grab the gun from her bag. Cross, however, was faster. She knocked the weapon out of her hands and sharply clamped them behind her back, cuffing her. "You're under arrest, Mrs. Harper," Cross said with cold calm. "And now you're going to have to explain what's really going on here." Sarah was sat down on the floor and Reed leaned toward her and asked, "Who is this man? And what is his connection to your husband's disappearance?" "It's my brother, Mark," Sarah said bitterly, her eyes darting around as if trying to find a loophole. "James and I planned it together, but then things got out of hand. In the interrogation at the station, Sarah started talking when she realized there was nothing more to hide. But her story was more complicated than the detectives realized. "James and I agreed to fake his disappearance," she began, sitting in front of the detectives at the glass table. "We planned to fake his kidnapping, get insurance, and get away. The money was to be split equally. I had Mark install cameras in the house, so we'd have proof for the insurance company." So it was a scam from the start? Cross clarified, leaning back in her chair. But what went wrong? James decided to cheat me. Sarah lowered her eyes, and her fingers began to tremble nervously again. He changed the terms of the policy at the last minute. When I found out about it, I realized he was going to run off alone with the money, leaving me with nothing. So you decided to be proactive? Reed clarified. Faked his death to get the insurance policy? Sarah nodded, her face turning white. I knew he was hiding in that abandoned house. I thought if I got rid of him, no one could stop me from getting the money. While Sarah and Mark testified, another group of police officers found the abandoned house Mark had listed. Inside, they found James tied up and beaten. He was rescued, but was in critical condition and was immediately taken to the hospital. When James regained consciousness, Detectives Reed and Cross arrived to hear his version of events. Sarah, she set me up, he whispered, struggling to cope with the pain. We actually planned the scam together, but when I realized how greedy she was, I decided to play my own game. I changed the policy and tried to escape early, but she found me and tried to kill me. What made you think you could outsmart her? Cross asked, looking him in the eye. I thought I knew her. James grinned tiredly, but she turned out to be more ruthless than I could have imagined. Sarah and Mark Harris were arrested on charges of fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy. James Harper, though he avoided jail time, found himself all alone. His condition had improved, but a long legal battle involving insurance fraud was ahead of him. He was left with no money, no family, and most importantly, no trust in people. Detectives Reed and Cross wrapped up the case, but a sense of bitterness remained. They realized that no one involved in this tragedy was an innocent victim, and each of them became a hostage to their own greed.